Hi students and welcome to this lecture recording. We're going to pick up in the very early years of the 12th century. So we've moved a little further forward now and just kind of wrapping up some narratives from the end of the First Crusade. So you can see here on the screen that Bohemond returns to Syria. He attempts to carve out his own kingdom in northern Syria based in Antioch, but is defeated. He then returns to Sicily to raise an army and attack the Byzantine Empire. But when he does so, he's defeated by Alexius. He returns to Sicily again, the Norman stronghold, and he dies there without ever returning to Antioch and without ever returning to the Holy Land. We already discussed Baldwin's success in establishing an alliance between Jerusalem and Damascus, between himself and this Turkish ruler Tugtigan. And then Baldwin and Alexius, who are kind of the last members from the First Crusade, both pass away in 1118, and this kind of brings to an end the era of the First Crusade. As we move on beyond 1118, you'll see that the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem faces new challenges. Or the new king of the Latin Kingdom is Baldwin II, who is a capable leader, but he's faced by an increasingly resurgent Sunni Islam led by the local Turkish leaders. And so this is linked to the fact that Ridvan, one of the local Turkish rulers of Aleppo, had been a Shiite, had been kind of broke up the balance of power among the different Turkish rulers, prevented any kind of unification. But when he dies and his son is killed, then instead he is replaced by a man named Ilghazi, who is a committed Sunni Muslim and a special general, a very talented general. He was someone who had a connection to Jerusalem. He had ruled Jerusalem as a subordinate of the Seljuks until the Fatimids had captured Jerusalem in 1098. So now we have a challenge where you have these three major Turkish strongholds, Aleppo, Mosul, and Damascus, and Aleppo and Mosul are now united under Ilghazi's rule, and this means he can put armies in the field that can really challenge the Crusaders. And in 1119, at the Battle of the Field of Blood, he defeats the local crusading forces in northern Syria, led by Roger of Antioch. And so this is a sign, this is really the first time that the Turks who are local to Palestine have defeated the Crusaders in a pitched battle. And it's a sign of a way the balance of power is shifting in the region. Find that even Baldwin himself, along with his successor as the ruler of Edessa, a man named Jocelyn, are captured by Ilghazi's successor. And after Baldwin II dies in 1131, Crusaders face a new challenge, a new and more serious challenge, which is the rise of Zengi, and this is coupled with ongoing infighting among the Crusaders themselves regarding the city of Antioch. So remember that part of what had been key to the Crusaders' initial success was that in critical situations they came together and unified, and the reverse had been true of their Muslim opponents. Now we're seeing that flip, where increasingly the Muslim opponents of the Crusaders are more unified and the Crusaders are more divided. Zengi maintained this unification of Mosul and Aleppo. He had the title of Atabeg, which is sort of a Turkish equivalent of being a duke, and he was uniquely effective among Islamic leaders as far back, really for about 500 years to the time of Muawiyah, in making Syria the foundation of his power and uniting Muslim Syria. This was a feat that hadn't been achieved really since the rise of the Abbasids. And so during the 1130s, Zengi remains focused on uniting Syria and uniting Muslim forces under his rule, except for Damascus, which remains independent, remains more closely aligned with the Crusaders. Meanwhile, you have instability in Antioch. And so remember that Antioch is a great city, a prestigious city. And so we find that the Crusaders and the Byzantine Empire continue to fight for control of Antioch after 1130 and the death of Bohemond II. So you have this conflict going on between two Christian groups, the Byzantines and the Crusaders, who had never got along super well anyway, and this is set against an alarming backdrop of an increasingly unified Muslim Syria. So you can see real challenges on the horizon for the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. How was the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem governed? As I explained at the beginning of the previous lecture, the Franks or the Crusaders are able to establish their own traditional feudal form of government in the region. But they are always a minority in the society. They're always only making up about 15 to 25% of the population. And so there are substantial Eastern Christians, Arabs, Jews who make up the rest of the population of the kingdom. And because of this, we see a lot of assimilation. It's not as though the Crusaders come here and immediately impose their own culture unrestrainedly. They certainly import their own mode of government. But in the areas of marriage, we find them intermarrying with Eastern Christians. In the areas of language, we find them learning to speak Greek and Latin. And we see them adopting Middle Eastern clothes and diets. We know this because pilgrims from Western Europe who come to the Holy Land after this, next generation Crusaders, are pretty surprised by what they find, that these Western European Crusaders who had been in the Holy Land for some time, in a lot of ways, live very much like their neighbors. One group that's a little bit different that it's important to recognize are the Italian merchants. So as we enter this period of medieval European history, the Italian city-states are an increasingly important source of trade and wealth for Europe, and the Italian merchants are expanding their trading networks into the Middle East by establishing themselves in the Holy Land. And so they have their own areas of Jerusalem and Acre and the major cities in the Holy Land where they are able to govern themselves, organize their economies to suit their pursuit of trade rather than your normal feudal agricultural economy. And they develop trade in cotton, in spices, in fruit, in sugar, all these important products that become a part of the Mediterranean economy that encourage a European increase or interest in products from outside of Europe. All that is taking place during this period. How does it work out with the fact that you have the Crusaders who have conquered this land, and you also have substantial Muslim and Jewish populations? Some historians have argued that the Christians and the Muslim populations lived either totally separate or totally integrated. But now, increasingly, we're pretty confident that the two populations lived alongside one another, but they lived in distinct communities. So in the countryside, you'll find Muslim and Jewish populations that live basically as serfs. That is, they're agricultural laborers in the countrysides, but they have their own dwelling places, they have their own communities. But they're kind of tied to the land in the way that medieval economic society was structured. So your wages were essentially the produce that you cultivated on the land. You were expected to work the land for the local crusader lord. In the towns, they have all the rights of free citizens, although they're not allowed to participate in government, to hold roles in the government. They're not permitted to hold roles in the military. Nevertheless, they continue to enjoy their own separate court systems. So if you commit an infraction, an offense, and you want to be tried under Muslim law or Jewish law rather than the law of the Crusaders, that was an option that was open to you. They still have the right to practice their religion openly. This is pretty significant in the history of Islam. This is the first time that you have Muslim populations who are living under a non-Muslim government. Remember that I explained at the beginning that traditionally for Islam, the government and the religion are synonymous. And so this is the first time that you see something a little different for Muslims here. We find that they become quite comfortable living under Latin law, and that even Arab Muslim chroniclers record that they're more comfortable they're better treated living under the rule of the Crusaders than they are living under the rules of the Turks, who were kind of these newer converts to Islam and were seen as a little more austere. So the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem has emerging political and military challenges that I've already talked about, but in terms of achieving religious coexistence, it's one of the more successful societies in the history of the medieval pre-modern Mediterranean. Next, we're going to turn and talk about the military orders, and I'll record another video to do that.